Hello and welcome to a new video. Today I'm going to be talking about Scorn, specifically the cut content. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a while. I've already made a video going over my long-form thoughts on the game immediately after playing and brought up the cut content, but it's such a major discussion in the Scorn community and fan base as it currently is, that I feel it does deserve another video on it, and quite frankly, it is quite important to me. You're probably surprised that I haven't been making a ton of Scorn videos. The game's out, shouldn't I be digging into the files and the lore and the art book and all of that, trying to piece together this larger world? Well, I suppose you can say that I myself have been scorned by the sheer amount of cut content and things in trailers that quite frankly never made it into the game and likely never would have. People who have watched this channel for a while knows I've been going over just about every clip and scene and pixel in the trailers, trying to figure out how it all fits together. So for entire trailers to have been, well, just trailers is immensely disappointing, especially from a game that advertises itself as requiring you to pay attention to absolutely everything because it might be important. It's not that I was wrong about some stuff, it's that there was no possibility of me being right, and nowhere in any of the trailers was there any indication of, hey, this isn't gonna be in the game, don't think about it. Where I should be extremely interested and invested in making videos on all the creatures and locations of the game, I've instead spent my time compiling TF2 clips into a montage, and I've been thinking more about a Poppy playtime theory than I have about a Scorn one. Yes, it's genuinely that bad. But the question was, how exactly do I approach this topic? Because I could just show you page by page of the art book and say, put this in the game, put this in the game, put this in the game, unfuck your game, Peklar. But that wouldn't exactly be very, productive, now would it? So instead I'm going to take this from a different approach. I'm going to pretend that I have billions of dollars and have the rights to the Scorn IP, and all the developers and equipment and whatnot are already set up, and I'm going to make changes to the game that would have made a good game significantly better. I'm aware that hindsight is 20/20. It's easier to be Epimethian than Prometheus. But technically, Ebb Software could have been that as well, because they were almost done with part 1 of the game before they decided to scrap everything. In fact, they were 2 months away from release of part 1 of the game before they announced that they would scrap everything. And given the fact that even as far as back as 2016, which has this shot here, rather prominent location in that year's trailer, that was part of the tower according to the art book, which came after the blasted labyrinth and the crater. And the devs have said they worked on things from like the start of the game to the end of the game chronologically during this period. So as far back as 2016, they were already pretty much almost done with part 1. I'm not sure what else they could have added if not Paulus. And if they added Paulus to it, then what the hell was part 2 supposed to be? I know it sounds like I'm getting extremely riled up, and I guess I am, but I cannot overemphasize how monumentally a bad decision it was not to release part 1 of the game, because then even if they did decide to scrap everything and start anew, they'd have player feedback. They likely don't have the luxury to do that again, at least not until 10 or so years later, when there's a Scorn remake, remaster, reboot. I mean, every other game is doing it. However, Being the modern era of gaming, there is one advantage that Scorn does have, and it's very rare for this to be a true advantage and not just a crutch for shit developers who can't release a working product. It's possible to go back into the game, alter things, and then that game is downloaded onto people's Steam accounts or GOG or the Xbox Game Pass, and the game is updated for people. And unsurprisingly, I think this is something that the Scorn devs should try to do with their game. We've seen even radical changes in games like No Man's Sky, let alone adding features and areas like what happened with, say, Agony and Agony Unrated. The last preamble to this video is a forum post on the Steam discussion page for Scorn. One person was accusing Scorn of being just a massive scam, citing specific quotes from the Steam page description that, according to him, just weren't in the game and were outright lies. Even if they aren't in the game, I think that's more an issue of incompetence and malice, and I don't agree with all of his points, though I will agree that some of them are leaning very, very heavily on technically. But the 2 points I agree with most is that the descriptions of an interconnected world that you explore non-linearly, and you'll have to think about how your actions impact the world, are definitely not the case in Scorn. The world is interconnected, sure, one place leads to another, but it is extremely linear. My digestive system is interconnected, but food goes in one way and comes out the other. The single moment where you kind of backtrack through the prologue area, but not really, doesn't count. And the game certainly doesn't ask you to really think about how your actions impact the world around you. Even the one choice you have in the game, Scoop or Saul Moldman, you don't even get to see the outcome of that when you revisit that area. Moldman is nowhere to be found, and believe me, I tried looking hard to see if he's there. And the rest of the game, players will have to think about how their actions impact the world around them, and they quickly realize their options are either do the thing and the singular outcome that the dev scripted will occur, or just turn off the game. And I don't think that being able to hide from the creatures or run around them or kill the creatures is exactly a big choice either. Every game that has non-mandatory combat has those choices. Oh shit, do I jump over the pit and stomp on the Koopa, or do I let it walk into the bottomless abyss? If I do that, the Koopa will die. Wait a minute, if I stomp on the Koopa, it doesn't die, it goes back into its shell. And so I save a life, but I take a stand against Bowser. And I've honestly put more thought into that stupid bit than I did in whether or not to kill the creatures. These are 2 things that I'm going to be keeping in mind when playing backseat game developer. So we gotta start at the beginning, and I think the prologue is actually pretty okay. It introduces Scorn's central puzzle philosophy. You solve smaller, kind of video gamey puzzles in order to solve a much larger environmental puzzle. You solve the mold man, moving the mold sacks around and switching the tracks, so you solve the larger puzzle of having to unlock those huge doors. There is one thing I would add, however, to that general location, the central room, that I think would increase the amount of thought that players put into the world around them when they see the consequences of their actions. I'd add a door. Nothing fancy, just a regular old Scorn door, with maybe a little puzzle near it that you have to solve in order to open it. And when it does open, it doesn't open all the way. There's no chance for your character to go through it. Oh, and if you hear noise in the background, that's my cat bleating into the void. Say hi to Cinder. But anyways, the door opens a little bit, it kind of malfunctions, you can't go through. Now, if you save Moldman, but you don't open the door, and you go back to that area, and you can go back to that area, you can see the extent of the damage that time has wrought. Then you see Moldman's decomposing corpse near that door. But if you do open the door, you don't find his corpse anywhere. The asset doesn't load in, the implication that he went through the door. Now realistically, it's unlikely that Moldman would survive for very long in such a harsh environment. After all, he's barely intelligible as it is. The guy even doesn't really understand the whole risky thing. Scorn guy has to force him to do everything. Some players could cope by saying, oh no, that leads to Moldman Paradise, and he spends his last days sipping martinis on a Scorn beach surrounded by friends and family. But realistically, he's probably just gonna die in another area, so it's not like you have a super good ending for our little buddy. But being able to see the consequences of both your action or your inaction, I think, would drive that point home further. Now, of course, that would have to be represented in other parts of the game as well, otherwise we're back to square one with the 2 decisions you can make at the very start of the game, not having any real impact or carryover into the rest of the game. The difficulty in that, of course, comes from the fact that it can't really be replicated in any part of Scorn. After all, that is an area that goes through a time skip. You start out with one person going through there, then the other person sees the consequences of Prologue Guy's action and the deterioration of time. Realistically, in-universe, Scorn's plot likely takes place over the course of a few hours, because that's how long it takes to play the game in general. Now, of course, if you were exploring things in a non-linear fashion, if you went to, say, the Big Bridge area in the crater, and then had the option to go to the Blasted Labyrinth, and then you went back to the bridge area and the environment was a little bit different, that would be one thing, but that would require restructuring of the game so severe that you might as well be making a new game. Unfortunately, even my powers as a backseat game developer can't really think of a way to fix that. I suppose I'll have to leave it up to the pros, but I'm just going to assume that Scorn is going to be fairly linear, in the sense you go from one location to another, and don't really have the option of backtracking. After the prologue, you wake up as the main Scorn guy. Scorn guy, as the community calls him, the primary player character of this adventure. The section of him growing out of the wall and then exploring the barren desert that is Scorn's world is honestly pretty cool. Though I will say, as a personal opinion, I much preferred the bright yellow and orange fog to the desaturated purple fog. Perhaps it's not necessarily super personal. After all, this game is inspired by H.R. Giger and Beksinski, and where Giger's works are mostly desaturated, he tended to be a very monochromatic artist. Beksinski was anything but. He often used a lot of vibrant colors, and I could tell that the color palette of Scorn was more inspired by Beksinski than Giger, so it seems then odd to ditch that in favor of the more desaturated tones of Giger, the lack of any warm colors in any of the environments except for the bright red glows of those aristocrat pods. Well, I'm the backseat game developer who owns Scorn's IP, so I say make it vibrant yellow and orange again. Other than that, there's really not much to do in that area except go down the single path that leads you to the inside of the facility. And I think it would be neat if that area was a bit more open and you were able to walk around and actually get lost. You can see the huge facility from different sides and get a better sense of the sheer scale of the place. In some ways, it would be a bit like an open world game, just far more restricted. It's not like Fallout New Vegas where you walk out the front door and then you can beeline your way to just about any location on the map. Instead, it's more like a limited little sandbox that you go to before you can go to the next one and the next one and the next one. Or in other words, very similar to the nature of the prologue area. That huge circular space that you can run around in and try to interact with different machinery in order to figure out what step-by-step process you have to do in order to progress further into it. The art book implies that there would have been like hostile creatures on the surface of Scorn's world, and that's why the crater might end up seeming like such a safe haven. But I'm kind of fine with there not being creatures. I don't think having to run away from something that can actually attack you would really add too much to the game. Having the ability to fight back and choosing whether or not you do, I think is very important to the game, and I will be talking about that at length later. Now, once you go back into the facility and you're going through that whole reactor area, that's honestly one of my favorite locations in the game. It also is another example of here's a big old space that you solve small puzzles in order to unlock this larger environmental puzzle. And I think the puzzles and lore are pretty well integrated. You have this mechanism that lowers these aristocrat pods, but maybe the mechanism can malfunction occasionally. So Scorn people made a tool that allows them to readjust the mechanism, and the tool allows the Scorn person to know how many they've readjusted and how many more they need to adjust. Once the whole thing is fixed, they can go back to the aristocrat pod area and then use that tool as kind of a key in order to unlock or open or lower the pods as a kind of security feature. After all, these are very important entities. You can't just be lowering them at any moment's notice. Back when civilization was flourishing, or at least just functioning, there probably would have been a few Scorn people, a few maintenance workers, so to say, making sure everything is up and running and operational. And then when the aristocrats are born, they get this special key that gives them access to everywhere else in Scorn's world, and the healing coral that allows them to, surprise, heal themselves as well as hold ammunition, likely indicating they're the ones who get to hold the guns, and Scorn Guy isn't supposed to. But why are these spinning mechanisms located across the facility? Well, I mean, Scorn's technology is very analog. It uses a lot of systems of levers and pulleys rather than wires and circuitry, and we've seen that any time tubing is a factor in Scorn society, they tend to really suck at handling it. Never ask a Scorn person to do cable management when building your PC. It'll be a disaster. While I would like to be able to go back down and see the Mold Men body pit, just to see what happened to them after all that time, and maybe see a few more areas that aren't mandatory to go through in order to progress through the level, overall I think it's a pretty decent place. Maybe make the flesh tubes that extend more fleshy and saturated if I really gotta nitpick and demand something, but overall I won't really change much of anything about that area. So you do the only real backtracking in the game, going through the prologue area, which I've already discussed before, and then you get to the crater, and the crater sucks. The crater is perhaps the worst area in the game, visually, gameplay-wise, and lore-wise. which is such a shame because it's where the majority of the game takes place. The whole area is a bit of an eyesore, and I think that's in large part due to the heavy green fog that seems to be present everywhere. The fog being there might be a Silent Hill type thing where without it, some people's machines just aren't able to run the game. The devs have expressed the difficulty in making the game work on the Series S. Now imagine if they didn't even have that minimum baseline to pass, but even lower tier computers. But nonetheless, it's fucking everywhere, and even worse, there were already heavy green fog stuff in the final parts of the prologue area, so we've already seen this color palette. We don't really want to see it again over and over and over. How's about a different color? How's about a heavy red? Or maybe a heavy yellow? Or maybe even a heavy blue, just something that isn't fucking green. There's also a fact that the textures and color palette of the environment in general has been heavily desaturated compared to the previous build. So just to make it clear, I'm not turned off from looking at this stuff cause oh, scary Giger architecture and gross flesh stuff. I'm turned off from it cause it just looks ugly. Ugly and same-ish, cause it's basically the exact same type of architecture throughout the entire facility. But gameplay-wise, it's no better, and I don't mean because of the combat that so many people complain about. I'll be talking about that a bit later. The problem is, there's really no exploration to the area. Both the Abate Assembly A and Abate Assembly B, with maybe a little bit more exploration in the Crater Queen area. Now to clarify, Abate Assembly A is a 2017 Kickstarter demo area. Abate Assembly B is the 2020 gameplay area. And then of course Crater Queen area is that final huge circular room. Now, maybe it would be unfair for me to compare the builds of the game between the final version and what we got to play with when the Kickstarter first launched. I would record footage from the Kickstarter demo, but I guess the devs decided to remove access to it from my computer, so give me access to the fucking demo, Peklar. I paid for it. Now, the focal point of the 2017 demo was, of course, the bridge. This huge structure that you raise up, where you can see there's multiple levels to this area. Now, maybe I'm in the wrong in assuming this, but I kind of assume that the bridge would play an actually important part in exploration. You raise it up and then maybe get access to parts of it from that wall area there, which, mind you, doesn't have any of the red gunk covering it in the gameplay trailer. That's just something they added in the demo. So you would be able to lower that wall and then access a bridge and potentially go to the other side there. What's on the other side? I don't know, maybe some sprawling hallways that leads to weapons or items, or maybe it even leads straight to the blasted labyrinth. You could go there, or alternatively you could just go straight down to the ending area, the place that the demo itself ended in. Or maybe you could lower the bridge and explore some of the lower areas, and those would have items, lore, health, whatever that would be there. It would be almost like a maze-like structure full of interconnected regions that you explore in a non-linear fashion. Maybe you could go back to the bridge area at some point and access a previously restricted area. That gameplay philosophy, being able to explore an area a little bit, then getting an item that allows you to explore even more, is what's known as a Metroidvania. And I think Scorn originally was going to be like that. In the 2014 failed Kickstarter pitch, one of the games that Scorn likened itself to was the Metroid Prime series. And while Scorn doesn't really follow anything from it, in fact the closest thing to being like Metroid Prime is the sheer amount of weird Rule 34 people drew of Scorn Guy and one of the characters from it, or maybe it's just because Scorn copies the general plotline of the third game, with a protagonist slowly being corrupted by an evil parasite. I think initially Scorn was going to be a Metroidvania, and you would have been able to see that play out in the bridge section, all of these different areas you could explore, perhaps even at any point you wish to, with maybe some being restricted by what items you have, but others being open to go to even if it doesn't have an actual purpose. It could just show off a little bit of lore, or it could be a dead end, or it could be a place that offers a few items. There's a game that came out recently called Bendy and the Dark Revival that I'd like to discuss briefly here. Spoilers if you're interested in playing that game but don't want to know about some late game content. Now, rather late into the game, you come across this room and this big, hulking ink creature kind of stumbles out and stands around. It's not hostile, though its presence is imposing, but you can't get around it. If you explore that room a little bit more, you find a note that says that the big ink creature, he's not, unfriendly, but he just really wants a snack that can be found in an earlier part of the game. Now, you try to progress further and you come across this door that you try to open, only to be told by a different ink creature that she can open the door, but in order to do so, you have to play a game of hide and seek. So you go through the area you were in before, but this time with a little bit of a twist. You're trying to find something rather than just avoid the gaze of these other hostile creatures. But when you do find her, she gives you a special ability, a unique new ability that allows you to fast travel back to earlier parts of the game, where you can then go into this kitchen area, utilizing powers you found along the way to explore previously inaccessible areas, get the item, go back to the big ink creature, he happily moves out of the way, you open the door, and what you get is an upgrade to the only weapon you have in the game. Bendy and the Dark Revival does what Scorn don't, and the real kicker is that both Bendy and Scorn were games that initially were supposed to be split into multiple parts, different chapters, and the devs decided, you know what, we're just going to release one full game. But where Bendy it actually feels like you got one full experience, Scorn ends up feeling like a gutted version of part 1 of 2. Not the full game at all. So going back to Abate Assembly Part A, all you do is move around a metal cage in a very particular way until you're able to get it into a position that allows you to progress further. Abate Assembly Part B is honestly no better, it's just straight up fucking linear. The Crater Queen is a little bit more interesting, but it's still rather devoid of any interesting puzzles or actual exploration. The set piece is just a little bit more cool. There's 3 puzzles to solve in the whole of the crater, the 2 spinning light puzzles and then that maze light puzzle. The rest is mainly just trying to figure out how to move metal cages from point A to point B, and just to open up the different areas below in order to access the gates, lower them, move them, whatever, so you can progress. In other words, it seems to ditch the philosophy of solving a bunch of smaller puzzles in order to solve a much larger one. And this wouldn't be too much of an issue if, again, the area actually looked rather nice, or if it really was kind of a central junction that allowed you to explore an interconnected maze-like environment. And lore-wise, What exactly is the fucking purpose of that place? I kind of assumed initially they were harvesting creatures in order to, put them in the central aristocrat pods, because those pods have, sliding gates you activate from the outside, implying that you're trying to keep something inside. But the Crater Queen is situated on top of an elevator that when it rises up it crushes her, so it's more likely than not her presence, and thus the presence of everything else, is accidental. There's no sliding gates in the prologue area that you went to earlier, so why are these aristocrat pods, why does it necessitate that they have sliding gates? Actually, where's the key and coral stations that the pods previously came with? Why are they even fucking there to begin with? I get tons of information about Scorn's world and its history and how it functions from the Field of Decay area, but once I get into the crater, suddenly there's absolutely nothing to offer. What about the bridge? It's basically a place to move metal spheres cages around. Why would they design it like that when there's only one place that the metal cages can go to? It's not like a central junction where, alright, the cage can go that way, or it can go that way, or it can maybe go down that way. It goes one way, which makes me wonder, why have a fucking bridge at all? Why not just have a regular old pathway to Abate Assembly Part B and save everyone on their time? You took something that made complete sense. There's this big old bridge that links these different levels of this facility that can be called to from different levels or could be moved up and down on the bridge itself, allowing for multitudes of Scorn people and supplies to be transported to different levels as need be. Maybe it's a little bit inefficient, but there are elevators strewn throughout the facility for much smaller, quicker access to different levels. In a previous video, I compared the puzzles in Scorn to those of Poppy Playtime, asking if, something actually malfunctions in the Poppy Playtime factory, did employees really have to put on this grab pack bullshit and solve some, wire and pylon puzzle to get the machines working again? And earlier on in this video, I talked about how the, Field of Decay prologue area, the puzzles there can actually be explained as being part of the overall world and how it might have functioned when society was running. I can't do that here. It's just stupid video gamey bullshit that makes absolutely no sense. So, as the official owner of the Scorn IP with billions of dollars in resources to make changes, I would get rid of that crane and the subsequent puzzles and just make it an area for exploration and a bit of combat. Maybe I'd axe Abate Assembly B. I'm just not really fond of that area either. Or maybe I would have different branching areas that shows exactly what's being broken down, what's being assembled, what's the purpose of this place in the larger machinations of Scorn society. Does it build the keys you use? Does it build the weapons? Does it build the various technologies that are found throughout Scorn society? Who knows? Now, I mentioned exploration and combat, and this is where some people would likely disagree with me and say Scorn shouldn't have any combat at all. After all, combat is one of the main complaints people had about Scorn. This is due to reasons that are mostly beyond Ebb Software's control. If you look at the Video Game Awards nominees for this year, the same 4 or 5 games crop up in almost every category. The 3 I'll talk about are God of War Ragnarok, Elden Ring, and Stray. God of War Ragnarok is a game coldly calculated to appeal to as wide of a demographic as possible. In fact, given you couldn't solve a puzzle or even look at an area without one of the other characters bleating in your ear how to solve it and progress through, it seems to now include DSP tier morons into the ranks of audience members it really wants to appeal to. And given that, like, the first game, the level designer did a presentation and used DSP's Let's Play as a reference, I'm probably not that far off. Elden Ring is a game that no one should go into expecting it not to be challenging. It's FromSoft. They're the, most well-known difficult game developers out there. Over the years and throughout all the games they've developed, their fanbase has expected them to release titles that don't hold your hand and expect the player to think and interact and learn in order to progress through the game. Stray, meanwhile, is this fun, casual game where you play as a cute kitty cat rummaging through a cyberpunk environment. These are all what I would call safe games. They're games that inevitably are going to get a positive score because they appeal strictly to a player base that knows exactly what they're going to get into. It's almost impossible for them to be truly bad games. Now, whether or not that applies to like the lore and story and puzzles in terms of God of War may be another discussion. Scorn, meanwhile, is not a safe game. It's actually a huge gamble. It's a survival horror game that doesn't hold your hand. And yet, by happenstance, almost by accident, it ended up being pushed by one of the richest corporations on the planet as one of the main reasons why you should buy a multi-$100 console. I think the Scorn devs intended the reception, or anticipation I should say, to be kind of similar to Agony. Yeah, people who are into horror games are looking forward to it, but it's not going to be a breakout trailer at E3 or Gamescom. It's just going to be a much more niche horror game. But instead, being exposed to such a massive audience, and being on Game Pass so this massive audience can basically access it for free, has allowed a significantly wider player base to play Scorn who aren't familiar with classic survival horror. Because a survival horror game where you have a gun but you're not awesome McBadass is a rarity in AAA video game scenes, and while Scorn is more AA than AAA, it definitely has the look of a AAA and has the backing and pushing of Microsoft as if it was a AAA. Basically, an entire console generation has skipped the classic survival horror formula, with the exceptions being Alien Isolation, which is a one-off title, The Last of Us, which is only available on PlayStation consoles, so anyone who exclusively plays Xbox isn't going to benefit from that anyways, and Resident Evil 7 and 8, which even then can get pretty actiony and less horror-y as the games go on. Now, this isn't to say there were no classic survival horror titles. There were many much smaller indie titles that appeal to the classic survival horror sense, but they never got the sort of notoriety that Scorn did, never stepping into that massive spotlight that Scorn was able to. Now, this isn't to say there weren't big horror titles over the last few years. There absolutely were that dominated the YouTube scene. The first was Amnesia: The Dark Descent, a hide-and-seek horror which does not allow you to fight back against the monsters, which has then produced a ton of Amnesia clones, with only the previously mentioned Alien Isolation really having any notoriety and allowing you to have a gun. Then PT came out and resulted in a shit ton of PT clones, which by their nature do not give you the ability to fight back. Often they don't even have a losing condition at all. Five Nights at Freddy's came out, and that spawned the entire horror genre of what if innocuous childhood thing, but scary. What differs this from the previous two examples is that rather than copying a gameplay style, it's instead copying a general aesthetic or idea, which leads to a multitude of different gameplay options, and yet none quite really capture the classic survival horror style. There's, of course, the Five Nights at Freddy's sequels, which you don't get a gun. There's Tattletale, which you don't get a gun. There's Baldi's Basics, which you don't get a gun. There's Hello Neighbor, which you kind of get a gun, but it's not really like an actual gun like you would see in something like Scorn. There's Amanda the Adventurer, which, why is this even as popular as it is? Please fucking stop, you desperate lore assholes. But no, you don't get a gun. There's Bendy and the Ink Machine, which you get a melee weapon, and I think you might get a gun as part of like an unlockable thing. I'm actually not 100% sure of that, but most of the game you don't get a gun, and of course you don't get a gun in Bendy and the Dark Revival as far as I know. I haven't watched Super Horror Bros' final episode on it yet, but I'm pretty sure you don't get one. And finally, there's Poppy Playtime, which, yeah, you don't get a gun. What's amusing is that there are more titles in this what-if childhood thing but scary genre of horror that do give you a gun. There's My Friendly Neighborhood, which is very much like a classic survival horror. There's Choo Choo Charles, which at least allows you to defend yourself as long as you're on the train. But these are upcoming titles, well after Scorn's release, so it's not like Scorn would have benefited from those games training players to realize that having a gun doesn't mean pulling the trigger whenever something moves. In fact, more likely than not, Scorn might help some people play My Friendly Neighborhood a bit less like a total shitter. So no, I don't think combat is necessarily an issue with Scorn. You have the option of just hanging back and letting the creatures waddle into a despawn zone. You have the option of just running by them. Though be aware that the Kiwis must have hundreds of hours under their belt with the AWP camping mid on Dust 2, because those little shitters will hit you no matter how fast you're trying to move across the map. And of course there's the option to try to attack the creatures. Ammo isn't as scarce as Ebb Software presents it, though you probably aren't going to want to try a kill everything run, especially on your first playthrough. However, I said mostly not Ebb Software's fault, and there is one thing I think Ebb Software could have communicated better, and that was aiming. You see, when you point the pistol at something and just hold the aim button, the reticle gets smaller, which allows for a more accurate shot. I've seen many people absolutely not realize this throughout playing through Scorn. The grenade launcher is, at the end of the day, mainly a puzzle item than a combat item. It's used to solve some environmental puzzles in Polis, and I wonder if the pistol could have at least once been used as an environmental puzzle that would have also taught the player the intricacies of its aiming system. It would have to be an optional puzzle because the pistol is an optional weapon. In fact, quite a few people outright missed it during their first playthrough of the game. Maybe it's one that allows you to further explore, or maybe it's one you have to solve if you do pick up the pistol. Like the area becomes restricted in-universe, maybe some system detected an unauthorized pistol access, and you have to shoot something small and far away in order to lift the restriction and be able to progress further. Now you know about aiming, and if you choose to forego that in favor of just running and gunning, then you really are a stupid shitter. There's not really much else I can think of what to do with this area. After all, it is incredibly linear. Every step absolutely matters, especially when there's gameplay and story synergy where if you go forward throughout the level, the parasite plays a little animation where it does a thing to you and you lose a bar of health. Maybe some alternate path or puzzle you have to solve in order to unlock an alternate path that allows you to lower all of the gates in the Crater Queen area right off the bat. Something that many players would miss, but astute explorers would eventually find, and they're rewarded by not having to face all of the dangers that come from that area. Of course, that could also come at the expense of completely missing the shotgun, assuming that the shotgun would even be located in that area when the game is revamped. But once you leave the crater, the next stop is Polis. Remember, the final game, they cut the blasted labyrinth, and they cut the tower, and it seems like Polis was just an incredibly rushed location. Like they needed to have something to justify the notion that we're combining both parts, even though the art book shows that the overwhelming majority of the game is still part 1. In order to unfuck Polis, you need to bring back the Blasted Labyrinth, because Polis, gameplay-wise, ended up being just the dumping ground of stuff from the Blasted Labyrinth. The Homunculi and Cyborg Krang boss fight, Blasted Labyrinth. The clamps and eventually crane that removes a parasite, if you look around it, the environmental storytelling has a bunch of cranks there, which tells me it's mainly made for that, so Blasted Labyrinth. So that leaves your player waddling around with his guts exposed, putting the red homunculi blood into the thing, stepping into that machine and getting his dick sucked, and then doing that, I won't even dignify it by calling it a puzzle, and then moving forward to the end. I think they forgot to add a part 2 to what was supposed to be part 2 of Scorn. Bringing back the Blasted Labyrinth offers a rather unique opportunity to have an actual non-linear area to explore, and the chance to have your choices matter in the grand scheme of things. Even if revamping the crater is just too difficult, too time-consuming, and just can't be done, they could at least salvage the game a little bit by ensuring that the Blasted Labyrinth and then the revamped Polis are closer to what Scorn is supposed to be like. Naturally, being a backseat game dev, I have quite a few ideas on what could be in the Blasted Labyrinth that would make it a genuinely interesting location. The world of Scorn contains a lot of mysteries, but the thing that kind of stuck out to me is that everything is ultimately centered around Polis. Everything is some kind of resource gathering facility that eventually leads to this one city, and the question is there anything outside of it? Now, the Blasted Labyrinth is supposed to be this site where two factions of homunculi were at war with each other, eventually exterminating each other in their desire to take back Polis. It being a war, maps and battle plans would have to be drawn, and I think it would be interesting if there were something like that. It doesn't have to be quite on the nose as my picture there, just something that the player can understand. Oh, this is a Blasted Labyrinth, here's a crater, here's a Genesis wall, there's Polis, and then there's different, representations of locations outside of that. Even if we have no idea what those locations look like or what they're for, it would still give the implication of there being a much larger world than what we're exploring. It would fit that world-building wisdom of being like an iceberg. You see the very top part of it, but the majority of it is what's implied based on what you're seeing, but you don't see directly. The second optional area you can go to, these are not mandatory places you need to explore in order to finish a game, after all this is a maze-like environment, is a place with a cart filled with homunculi pods and a bunch of dead Scorn people or even aristocrats nearby it. You can press a button and that causes a cart to move to an unknown area, one yet to be explored. We'll come back to that later. Now, we're moving all the shit that was supposed to be in the Blasted Labyrinth from Polis back to the Blasted Labyrinth. And I think the order of events could be honestly reversed. Rather than start out with the boss fight and then the parasite removal, the parasite removal comes first. It's an option you can do prior to the boss fight. This has a consequence. If you keep the parasite, you have all of your weapons. You have the ability to heal. You have the ability to reload. And then maybe in the subsequent boss fight, the parasite takes over your arm and you do the, little grenade thing. However, if you remove the parasite, then you lose the ability to heal. You lose the ability to reload. In fact, you don't even have a gun. Maybe the only thing you have access to is that piston tool, which leaves you far more restricted than if you were able to face something with a bit of range. Now, the player has a choice. Do I want to keep the parasite and make the boss fight easier, but face the consequences of my choice? The parasite continues to be a problem. Or do I remove the parasite and make the boss fight far more difficult for me, not having the luxury of being able to heal and all, but perhaps this is overall better for my character and could lead to a different outcome down the road. The parasite has had its presence throughout the game, and obviously it's important to the theme of the game and the idea of having a symbiotic relationship that eventually becomes lopsided. But if we're keeping the crater area in general, and allows for the parasite tendrils to start to take over your arms and legs and dig through your skin, I'm pretty sure any player by that point can understand, hey, this ain't exactly going well, hopefully we can get rid of this thing. The point is made even before you lose access to the multitudes of weapons or to your other hand at all. After the boss fight, maybe there's a bit more exploring, maybe there's some other enemy encounters that you either have the option of using the grenade or something else. There's the option to become a cyborg as shown in the art book that could be a part of that area. But perhaps I shouldn't be talking about this so nonchalantly, cause it really is important that you can turn yourself into a cyborg. One of the things Peklar said he wanted to explore was the increasingly intertwined relationship between man and technology. How we're less and less able to get away from our gadgets, the tools of our own making. They become integral to how we live our lives and even control our lives in some ways. The wrist key you get is a pretty good example. It's this tool that's painfully embedded into your arm, permanently stuck there but necessary in order to interact with the world around you. Prologue guy gets it, Scorn guy gets it, Mold Man can get it, and even the sentries get it. You need that tool, and it's likely a standardized thing across all of Scorn society. But other than that, I'm not seeing it with anything. The key you use to open actual doors, that's just a ranged key, a key to what's effectively a lock. That's been around since the medieval era. Hell, it's been around even before that. The piston machine you use to unlock certain gates, that's attached to the parasite. It's not even something you can have on its own. And the parasite isn't a tool or technology, it's something born completely from an accident. It quite frankly should not exist. There's no lesson to be had about the promise and perils of intertwining ourselves with technology because it quite frankly is not a technology. There's fuses, I guess, you use in the Crater Bait Assembly Part A to access more of the bridge area, but like, alright, cool, I'm not exactly going to be writing about the Industrial Revolution and its consequences because I had to grab a thing to do a thing. There's the connecting your brain to the hive mind in Paulus and the surgery automaton, I guess. But by that point, you have your guts hanging out. It's literally the only option available to you. It's a necessity to undergo that procedure. Are we becoming too intertwined with the tools of our making? Dude, if I don't do this, I fucking die. The only problem in Scorn's world, and as far as technology and intertwining it seems to be, is that they never got around to inventing anesthesia. But we did, so whatever tools we end up permanently connecting to ourselves, we can at least rest assured that we aren't going to feel the painful processes of it. So in other words, bring back the ability to become a cyborg. Because right now you have this whole important theme and discussion in the game that quite frankly only comes up once. And while you're at it, you might as well also bring back like the ability to get your gun to eject some volatile, foul, biological matter, maybe as something that needs to be charged up, but far more effective than the piston. So that's a blasted labyrinth, and next in the art book is a tower, but I'm fine with a tower not being in the game. I actually understand the developer's reasoning for removing it. It's thematically way too similar to the Crater Queen area. Now that kind of bridge you saw at the end of the 2016 trailer should be in the game in some capacity. It's become such an iconic location over the years for people who knew about the game and were eagerly anticipating it. But for the larger structure and gameplay associated with it, I completely understand why it was removed. So the only place left that we really know of is Paulus. Maybe there's supposed to be a location after Paulus, maybe quite a few locations after Paulus. After all, we really don't even know if Paulus was strictly Part 2 area, or if it was a Part 1 area and we legitimately did get a completely gutted version of Scorn Part 1 advertised as the full game. Like, legitimately, it all depends on where this little shit is supposed to be. Is this a blasted labyrinth, or was Paulus always part of Part 1? But let's assume Paulus is Part 2 of the game, and it takes place in Paulus. Well, we've removed all of the gameplay elements of it. The boss fight, the removing of the parasite. So, what can we do with it? Well, first of all, let's make Paulus big. And by that, I mean make it an actual huge sprawling area that you can explore the varying interconnected regions and vast rooms. Make it what the crater should be. And this is where the choices that we made in the blasted labyrinth can come to play. Let's say that you approach Paulus with the parasite and you want to open the door because that's where the ascension zone is. You're going to have a much more limited access to Paulus because all you have is a grenade launcher and not even access to your other hand. So you have to solve one puzzle, it opens a door, you go through, and then basically the same ending as a basic game happens. A parasite takes over, you turn into a meat pillar. You use the parasite as a tool in order to make the boss fight easier. Now the parasite uses you as a tool in order to do parasite stuff. If you choose to turn yourself into a cyborg and do nothing else, then you have much more access to all the varying areas of Paulus. Maybe you can't solve things in exactly the same way that a parasitized Scorn guy could, but you could go to many more places, see many more things, and interact with much more of the environment. The door opens and you go through the vortex unimpeded. And we don't need to know necessarily what's on the other side. That could be left to the imagination. Maybe it is like a total paradise back there. Maybe it's a hellscape. Maybe it's much of the same as the rest of Scorn World. Or maybe it's an area with the laws of physics so different that Scorn guys effectively atomize the moment he goes through. But maybe you were a more thorough explorer beforehand. You go to Polis, you explore around, and oh shit, it's these guys, I remember them. You remember that optional button you could press in that optional area to optionally move those homunculi jars over to some unknown location? Well, now you're at that very location, and you can utilize them in order to do the ascending process and become a weird flying squid head. This gives you access to a different part of Polis, one that even a cyborg Scorn guy could not reach. And there you're able to do a giant switch-based puzzle where you inhabit different bodies in order to open up a different gate that leads you to the Nexus. And I think if there's anything aesthetically about that part of Polis that should be, it's that it should actually be vibrant. The art book mentions a lot of psychedelic imagery, and if Scorn remains super desaturated, I think it would be a good reward visually for the player that they are able to see some extreme, bright, vibrant, lively colors. Another game that the 2014 Kickstarter compared Scorn to was Journey, and one of the design philosophies of Journey was, we're not going to show players bright blue colors. That's something we're saving for the very final area as a sort of visual reward. We're human beings, we like bright blues. That means daytime, that means life and activity. And the same thing could be done for Scorn. It is a little bit more vibrant in the base game, but I just don't think it's vibrant enough. It still looks extremely desaturated. And hey, you radically expand Polis, you can put the horsecock back in, a fan favorite that you yourselves have noted. In effect, for all three versions, I think Polis should be an area where you solve a bunch of smaller puzzles in order to solve the larger environmental puzzles. The one for the parasitized Scorn guy is going to be much simpler. After all you have access to is a grenade launcher. For the cyborg Scorn guy, they're more complex, more difficult smaller puzzles, and a more difficult larger puzzle. And for the Ascended Scorn guy, it's something that might require you to think very out of the box. Think about, say, Portal and the unique mechanics that comes with that. Only instead of thinking with portals, you're thinking with shells, having to move different bodies around and solve the smaller puzzles that come with the body's placements in order to get everything perfectly in place in order to access the end of the game. One final need to pay attention to your environment and consider what the impacts of your actions are. Naturally, doing all three of these would be tied to achievements, meaning you will need to play through the game multiple times in order to get all of the achievement, finally making that a factual statement and not a technicality. And yeah, I guess that's really all the changes I can think of. Changes that would take the things that were good about Scorn and that people enjoyed and add more to it and make the game even better. Because that really is the main problem with Scorn. It is a good game, it just could have been great. Now, I sincerely doubt the devs would be watching this video or even thinking about implementing all this stuff. Even though I might be the main Scorn YouTube lore theorist, I don't have any jurisdiction over this game. In fact, many of them probably don't even particularly like me. Hell, they didn't even send me one of those Xbox controllers that they sent to other influencers, so they can post a controller on their Twitter and that's like free advertising for the game to a bunch of random normies. They will be in contact with me to ask for my address, or at least to verify the address they have on hand for when I do get the physical Kickstarter stuff, but it's ultimately all up to them, and we can only continue to ask for them to add more to the game. There is one advantage they have the staff, they have the computers, they have the software. They're not setting everything up, just about everything is set up. Funding, another major problem that plagued them during the early days of the game's development, probably isn't that too big of a deal now anyways as well. After all, the game is out. It's sold copies on Steam, GOG, and Epic's Game Store. They also probably continue to get some money from Microsoft for the Game Pass deal. And I don't imagine developing a game in Serbia is all that expensive. In fact, I recall an interview where Petler even pointed out it's much cheaper to develop a game in Serbia than somewhere like California. However, that's not to say that expanding on the game isn't going to be difficult, or that it's not going to take a huge amount of time. After all, Scorn is a complex game in of itself. You can't just design a chair in Scorn World and heavily reference a real-life one. You need to make something that can function similar to a chair, but is barely recognizable as one, and has all these organic forms and intricacies to it. They need to model these areas, they need to light these areas, add in the textures, if there's any new creatures or enemies or NPCs in general, they need to develop the AI, they have to test these areas, they have to have music and sound effect for these areas. It's a major task, but I think it's a task worth doing. I'm firmly in the camp of people who want to see more of this game. It's such a unique world and universe that it would really be a shame if it's just left as this gutted version of what would have been the first part. Whether they update the game incrementally, adding an area or two or changing this or that along the way, or it's one huge expansion, I'm all for it. Megna, the community manager, has acknowledged that people want to see more of this game on the latest Pulse monthly update. And he's kind of, sort of, maybe hinted that they do intend to add to the game in response to some Twitter replies. But we really aren't going to know until they say so, whether affirmative or declining any opportunity to expand on the game. But if they announce tomorrow that the game will be expanded upon, but it's going to take a while, that would be fine. I'd understand completely. And unlike, say, the 2018 major delay, where they were almost done with the game, but didn't release what they had, and then they were silent for vast periods of time, this would be different, because the game is out. We could go back and play it anytime we want. No one who backed them on Kickstarter asked for them to take this Kowloon Knights deal and then turbo delay the game. But many people who backed the game on Kickstarter or bought the game on release are asking for them to do this. But at the end of the day, the choice remains firmly theirs. And until we get a definitive answer, I hope you enjoyed the video, that I gave you something to think about, and otherwise entertained you. Take care.